Hi, this is Steve Hargadon and Audrey Waters. Hi, Audrey.
Hello.
It's the 14th of September, Friday night. And
you're in Portland. Yeah.
I am in Portland, and you're in California. We've sort of swapped places in some ways. This is the Hack Education podcast, weekly podcast, looking at Audrey's stories and the news of the week. And Audrey, you were sick this week.
I was sick this week. I started off raring to go on Monday and came back from a quick trip to San Francisco with some sort of flu bug that's knocked me down for the count all week.
I'm so sorry. But we still have lots to talk about, I think.
Yes.
Okay, so your first post is really just sort of a list of other resources. I'm really intrigued by the whole question of what somebody this Ed Startup 101 course, the resources they would choose. You say they recommended EdSurge and Horizon Report. Were there other recommendations as well, or were those actually their only two recommendations?
Oh, this ties together so beautifully. The class also recommended TechCrunch, which for a long time has been one of the leading sort of tech industry blogs. And so those were really the three resources that were suggested to the class. And I wanted to recommend other ones. I wanted to recommend other technology journalists who I think do a far better job than TechCrunch in covering education. And then I wanted to sort of reference other education writers that I think write smart things about technology. And then just in general, a list of other really important blog posts and resources if you're making your way into ed tech as an entrepreneur, whether you're coming at it as an educator or as a technologist. I think that there are lots of ways that you should ground yourself in and not just pay attention to a handful of or a very small selection of blogs.
So do you want to call anything out in particular that you would add to their list?
Well, I would definitely make a case for the Audrey test, I think, that I wrote. And then the guide that sort of came out of that. A lot of people have come together to write about the things in which we think that every technologist in particular should know about education. So we'll look at some of the history and the research and theories about teaching and learning to give people a good introduction to the education part of that ed tech equation, which I think gets missed far too often.
I was surprised at the number of links here that I wasn't sure I was fully familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
I think I need to do some homework.
Well, especially if you're going to start an ed tech startup, Steve.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be accused of not living up to my own high standards.
Me too.
It was interesting. I mean, I guess I saw Betsy Corcoran this past week. Who was grateful that I wasn't harsher on her, but I also sort of thought, well, not that you and I necessarily should be carrying any more weight. But it's interesting that EdSurge would be on that list, because I'm not sure I would have put EdSurge on a list for somebody really serious about it. Is it just because they cover the financial aspects of Silicon Valley?
I mean, I do think that's certainly how they position themselves. If you want a quick, and if you do want sort of a quick newsletter once a week that'll lay out all of the recent funding rounds, which I think you do have to monitor, or people do monitor closely when they're in that process of raising money. Which investors are investing, who's raising how much from whom, building what sorts of products. But I don't think that it's necessarily a blog that talks about sort of the wider landscape of how we learn and how we teach with technology. I really think it's focused on the business, the startup business.
So here would be my concern. It's so focused on the financing and the money that it seems like it would almost skew toward not thinking about the teaching and learning. And again, I don't mean that as being critical. I just mean in terms of the space that it occupies.
I think that the website that they've built out is starting to review more products and more startups, and they have a lot more information in sort of company and product profiles that explain not just sort of how much money companies have raised, but what they build and links to other stories. And I think that they do want to become a resource for far more than just the financial piece. I mean, I think they do want to review what works in terms of teaching and learning. But I think, I do think that their strong suit certainly is in sort of this sort of a knowledge, that sort of industry, a snapshot of the industry right now. And whether or not that industry pays close attention to teaching and learning is, I don't think that's something we should lay at EdSurge's feet.
Interesting. Okay, so and I've bookmarked for my own personal reference. So the next story is about TechCrunch Disrupt.
Yes.
And you and I both went to events this past week where we both left partway through.
Yeah.
You were at the TechCrunch Disrupt, and I was at the Lead Commission. So what was your experience there? Well,
I have to say that this wasn't the sort of event that I like to go to, or this is not an education-focused event or ed tech-focused event. This was a Silicon Valley industry event put on by TechCrunch, now that very popular technology blog, now owned by AOL. And this was a high-price event, I think almost $3,000 per ticket. But it was really sort of an industry press event. But a couple of teachers had convinced me that I should go because there was going to be an education panel featuring Sebastian Thrun, Sal Khan, and Joel Klein. So I got myself a press pass, and I flew up to San Francisco for the day. And needless to say, I was thoroughly disgusted by many aspects, the tone of the event, the ways in which education was discussed, the ways in which technology in general was discussed, and it was, it's no surprise. It's no surprise that I came home sick. But I did start to have a lot of fun tweeting it, which I storified in this blog post.
So I'm trying to remember where it was that you wrote about sort of the non-critical attitude. And I felt that way at the Lead Commission. I felt like there was just sort of this surprising willingness just to accept anything that was said and kind of clap and believe that it was good. Was that at TechCrunch Disrupt that you were experiencing that?
Absolutely. A great example of this was Cory Booker, who the Newark mayor, who came on stage to talk in part about his latest sort of venture. He's an entrepreneur now, a co-founder of a site called Waywire, which is aimed at teens, helping them express themselves using various social media and video tools. But the conversation, the interview was conducted with kid gloves on, and no real substantive or sort of critical questions were posed at Booker at all. And interestingly, the person interviewing him is a real expert on Facebook, and so not surprisingly in Silicon Valley, this question of Mark Zuckerberg's substantial donation to the Newark City schools came up. And again, sort of no real pushback on what that money's done, no real questioning of how sort of the politics, that sort of intersection of politics between powerful people in Silicon Valley and powerful people in the government. It was really just a chance for Cory Booker to sort of lay out his political agenda without any sort of journalistic, inquiry. It was really disappointing.
Was there anything else from that event that you would want to point out?
Well, I haven't even talked about the education panel, which was, which again, the questions that were coming from the interviewer on stage, I felt were really trying to get the three panelists to bash teachers. It was of course, Monday was the day that the Chicago teachers went on strike, and I felt, Cory Booker made a sort of alluded to teachers' unions, and there was this real tone of, real anti-educator tone. I felt not always overt, but certainly implicit in a lot of the things that were being said. But I must say that Joel Klein did make me almost laugh out loud when he described his new project, Amplify, News Corp's new education project, as dynamized, customized, gamified instruction. And
and those words don't mean much to you?
They don't. I mean, I felt it was just a funny sort of string of adjectives that sounded that you had sort of slapped on, that he sort of slapped onto. It was the same old, but with all of the right marketing terms that were being sort of placed upon it.
This is the point at which you tweeted, "Oh my gosh, ha 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 ha."
Yeah, I mean, I was pretty miserable at this event, and I started. I think as the morning proceeded, my tweets got sort of more and more snarkier and snarkier, and people who weren't at the event were responding quite hilariously on Twitter as well. I should note here, as a side note, really love Storify as a tool to be able to collect together what happens on Twitter, what happens in blogs, photos, videos. For me, I use it quite often to sort of capture my notes from events, but I'm really finding it a great way to sort of tell a story about events as well.
I'm looking at your post, and there's this classic video link with Mr. Burns.
Yes. I can't possibly be the only person who thinks that Joel Klein is reminiscent of Mr. Burns.
Yikes. Well, we're going to get to another story in the news that will bring me back to the lead commission.
Yes.
And I probably felt a little less snarky, but just more kind of discouraged that there didn't seem to be a perspective on what was actually taking place. Several people I was standing next to kind of looked at me at one point and said, "Why are we here?" And then somebody else said, "Well, I wasn't even paying attention during the session." I realized just bringing together a group of people with big names doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get to an output that's going to be valuable for education.
Right, and I think that was one of the things that was really striking to me. So the audience at TechCrunch Disrupt was overwhelmingly, I would say, young white men, and that's a pretty typical audience, I think, in a lot of Silicon Valley tech-oriented events. But I was really struck, particularly, I think, with the adoration that you could feel in the audience towards Sal Khan and towards Sebastian Thrun. That there was actually, I would say, towards Cory Booker even. That, to me, it felt as though there was an audience who really didn't know much of the lay of the land of education technology, ed reform. It was really being, I think, led along to certain conclusions, to sort of strange and awful conclusions. And it felt as though that there are ways in which powerful people do influence certain audiences. I think an audience that had been more in the know and more immersed in ed tech, and in fact, several of the ed tech entrepreneurs that were in the audience were sort of mortified to hear some of these conversations. And I think that there's a danger of celebrities not boring us to death, but actually sort of misleading us as well.
Okay, so let's segue from there into your next post, which, although you title it being about Ed Startup 101, it's really more about kind of your mulling over your role. And the lead into that would be that what you saw at TechCrunch Disrupt was not really journalism, it was marketing.
Right.
And so let's sort of talk about that a little, if you would,
yeah.
And kind of what you're thinking about in terms of what you're doing.
Well, I feel it definitely strikes me that in a lot of cases, what crosses the wire, or what ends up in blog posts, it's not necessarily. I mean, they're press releases. Such and such company raised investment. Such and such company launched an app. Actually, the kinds of things that I put in my weekly roundup. It's not really something that you've gone. It's not really journalism that you've gone out and asked questions and sort of got to the bottom of things. It's actually just sort of restating the news that these companies want you to say about them. And I feel very much that happens a lot of times in the technology industry. I mean, a great example this week, Apple held a press event. They announced the latest iPhone, and the media attends this, and they don't oftentimes offer. I mean, they're really just repeating what was said on stage to them by the company. And I feel like that happens a lot in technology. I feel like it's now starting to happen a lot in ed tech, where we aren't really asking questions. We're just being told. We're being told the story. Such and such, company releases a product, and I guess therefore they have so many users. Therefore, learning must occur. And so I feel like I do something very different with hack education. And so the trick here is is it a startup?
Yeah, and you've I've argued that point with you. Argue is too strong a word, but I guess I've suggested that what you're doing is important enough to consider it like a startup, so that it can sustain. And then you get to the sort of interesting questions of periods of time in history where patrons were needed in order for certain work to get done.
Yeah. Because
really the financial incentive isn't there. You're almost sort of hoping for somebody who will say, "This is important and I believe in it."
Right.
I loved your use of the Venn diagram as a way of describing the connecting of education and technology. I think I kind of knew that, but you're actually saying that really helped me in terms of thinking about where the overlap is. But it's almost, I don't know that much about Venn diagrams, but I know they can go up to multiple layers and levels.
Right.
But it feels like there's a place at which technology and education cross that's valuable. It also feels like there's a place where people believe they cross.
Yes.
Right? That isn't valuable. And how do you represent that?
I think about this all the time. In fact, there were a couple of news stories this week that made me think about this as well. One of them was maybe it was the Lead Commission who said that they announced a survey that said, students and parents and teachers believe we should spend more money on ed tech. And I thought, well, what does that mean? Like, and then another one was, students in China use technology more than students in the U.S. and Germany. And I thought, well, to what end? It's not as though necessarily, I mean, we have to have I think the way in which things overlap is education and technology. We need to sort of have more nuance too, and not just sort of lump it as tools in the classroom, or I guess that's sort of an anti-Venn diagram argument in some ways. But I do think that the ways in which they overlap, it doesn't necessarily mean sort of better learning, and it doesn't necessarily mean more efficiency, and it doesn't necessarily mean cost savings. And
I read those stories. Actually, Marie read them to me in the car driving here. But I heard those stories and thought, like the Dell report and the Lead Commission, if you're a college graduate, and you hear those stories and don't ask deeper questions, then something's wrong, right? I mean, the idea that some percentage of parents think there should be more money spent on technology, that doesn't really tell you really anything substantive.
Right, and nor does the figure. I saw a couple of blogs picked up on it that Chinese students use technology more than American and German students do. I mean, how are they using technology? What is that? What does that actually look like? What are we counting as learning, as technology use that's educational for students? Is it only things that happen in the classroom? What do those classroom practices look like? And is necessarily more technology better? why do we, that's sort of the implicit, I think that's sort of the implicit assumption here, but I don't think that's necessarily the case.
It sure feels as though that might be the start of a really interesting discussion, but standing alone as a conclusion lacks the kind of credible depth that would give you some informed understanding of what's actually going on in that intersection of technology and education.
Right, right.
So I interviewed Pat Ferenga this week. He partnered with John Holt, the homeschool guru, and then sort of took over a number of the John Holt projects. And I did not really know the history of John Holt as an educator and as an influential educator, but very active in education, very active in looking at education reform, and then ultimately says, you know, this is not about reform. There's something completely different that needs to go on here. And I don't want to draw too strong a parallel, but I feel like those people that I respect in this industry who've been around for a while, all of them seem to have kind of gone through phases of significant interest in and discussion of technology, but then really shift toward discussions of learning.
Yes.
And the technology becomes secondary. And I feel like I'm not going to compare myself to those folks, but in my own way, I've gone through that same transition, and I feel like and I'm wondering, how long do you feel like hack education is actually going to be around technology? And at what point are you going to admit it's that you don't really care about the technology and it's really about the teaching and learning?
Right. I think about that every week, in fact, when I assemble the items I include in my weekly roundup of news, because there are often stories that aren't about ed tech per se. I mean, there are ones that are sort of clearly political. There are ones that are about policy, legal decisions. Ones that tend to sort of, again, if we're thinking Venn diagram, they're certainly in the education circle, but they don't necessarily cut into that tech piece. So I think that the questions will become more and more entwined, and it will be harder for us to sort of extract the technology from almost all of our practices, intellectual practices, professional practices, how we learn, how we teach, how we communicate. I mean, I just think the technology is becoming deeply, deeply intertwined in how we conduct ourselves as people. So I do think that at some point the technology will disappear, but I actually don't feel like it's like the tech part is what I sort of focus on as much today. Although I don't know, maybe I think it's in a lot of examples, it's an interesting window into other conversations about teaching and learning. I mean, I would say that's one of the great things that that Khan Academy has provided. It's not just a matter of being a bunch of online videos. It's actually started a lot of conversations about what teaching should look like, what learning looks like, how do you use time in the classroom, things like that.
So I like that a lot. I think that's a good way to go. So let's segue from there into a place where there's a lot of conversation right now about teaching and learning, and that's Chicago.
Yeah.
And I've been kind of out of internet touch for a couple of days, but I did read a quick headline that said that it felt like they were getting close to a resolution. I've
heard that on and off all day today, but I haven't heard any final confirmation. Granted, I haven't looked at Twitter in the last couple hours, but...
I mean, if I were President Obama and I'm looking at a November election and I've got Rahm Emanuel in Chicago, I'm probably going to be making the call, right? Figure this out quickly. Get this done.
But in many ways, I think that the stakes are really, it's a really interesting, considering that this is Chicago, which I think Chicago has, the photo that I use in this picture is purposefully chosen. Chicago was where the first teachers union was founded in the late 1800s. Chicago is the site of the first teacher strike in, I think, roughly 1902. Chicago has a long and proud history of in the labor movement. I mean, Chicago is very much about labor in this country, and I think what's happening with the schools and the vision that Rahm Emanuel, Barack Obama, and Arne Duncan, 3 Chicagoans, the vision that they have for the future of education is an anti-union vision. And so I think watching this unfold in Chicago right now is absolutely fascinating. And it's fascinating to think about what, how we've managed to get to this place in time where this would all be unfolding right now before the election too.
And being in Chicago is also interesting because Chicago is intriguingly high politics.
Yes.
Right. I mean, it's the deep muck.
Yes.
Right. That goes on in Chicago. So I called a friend and said, "Hey, I'm doing this sort of nonpartisan series of conversations around education. Should I come to Chicago and just hold some community meetings to talk about education?" And the response I got was, "Well, that sounds like a good idea, but I can't be involved because I can't be seen as potentially being on one side of this issue." And I thought, that's an intriguing moment.
Yeah.
I read some stories that said that there's a high amount of public support for the teachers.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, I gave a little bit of a cheer.
Me too, and I think that this is a really this strike is very much about the future of education in this country. I mean, this isn't just about sort of teachers demanding a contract that offers them sort of better pay and benefits and working conditions. Although in this case I would definitely stress working conditions. This is very much about this sort of new sort of political initiative that we're seeing from the right and the left, or from the Republicans and the Democrats rather, to sort of reform education by sanctioning charter schools, by obliterating tenure, by taking apart the unions, by really fixating on standardized testing as the way in which we measure not just student performance but teacher performance and school performance, tying that to funding, as we've seen with Race to the Top. And so to have all of this sort of explode in Chicago, I think is really interesting. And I'm not surprised that the population of Chicago feels this way. Again, it's a city with deep, deep ties to labor. But what's interesting is how this is being explained nationwide, and whether or not this will bode poorly for the president in his reelection bid. And what it'll look like in terms of education reform initiatives all over the country as well.
We had dinner last night with a guy who's in organic farming, and he was talking about sort of big agriculture and a lot of sort of really similar issues to sort of the commercialization or corporatization of education. And he said, sort of naively, there should just be somebody who really speaks up clearly, defining sort of thoughtfully the issues in education. And again, this is a horse that we've probably beaten to death. But has anybody stood up who's sort of a major political figure and said, this really is the important discussion?
A political figure, I'm trying to think. No, I mean, I think that there are people like Diane Ravitch, but I can't think of a politician, no, who's spoken up about this.
Which again is intriguing. I mean, as soon as this strike was announced, I remember reading that Mitt Romney had sort of sent a message, probably very similar to President Obama. This is hurting the students. The teachers need to get back to work. And you would hope that somebody would stand up and say, somebody with some political clout, and say, well, actually, what the Chicago teachers are saying has some accuracy, which is hurting students is a current set of policies. It's always giving me so there's breaking news that a tentative deal. That's the one I've read today, so we don't know if it's
I heard that
2 hours ago.
Yeah.
So voting on Sunday. Interesting. Okay, well, this touches so many things. I actually, from my standpoint, my hope is that this is sort of the, harbinger of conversations to come. That this opens the door to more people having this conversation about how, really what should we be measuring and what's important in education.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Tell me about Course Builder.
So this was Google announced this week that it was, or Google actually unveiled this week that this is the source code for the platform that it used to run its, quote, MOOC. Earlier this year, it ran a class on how to be a power searcher. So they released the code for Course Builder. I don't know if there's actually much interesting code there. I mean, then what really is interesting are a couple of things. One is that we have this Google code now. Stanford also released a code for one of its online courses. And there's also the promise that edX, the MIT Harvard initiative, is going to be open sourcing its code as well. So that's interesting. That's interesting in thinking about what does it mean when you sort of throw code out there. Is there going to be a community of developers who pick this up and run with it? Are people really going to use these to offer their own online classes? Phil Hill offered a really interesting analysis over on eLiterate, which made a lot of sense to me. Which this is actually less about sort of Google getting in the online education game per se than trying to convince folks that they should use its cloud infrastructure to run their education initiative. And he points out that Amazon is really sort of leading in sort of their market share of who's running their stuff in the Amazon cloud. So I thought that to me made a lot of sense.
Is Course Builder in any way sort of uniquely constructivist that it would be worth thinking about it from that angle?
No.
Okay, so there you go.
It's another one of these videos plus multiple choice quizzes equals online learning. Okay,
so Education Superhighway.
Yes.
They were actually one of the presenters at the Lead Commission report.
Right.
And this was an interesting moment for me because, of course, with all of those big-name people in the audience in a fairly small room, I raised my hand to find myself feeling a little tongue-tied. I'm laughing at this moment. It was a little embarrassing at the moment. But, okay, I want to tell you what happened, and I'm interested in your take on it.
Okay.
So they stood up and they said, okay, we've looked at the aggregate demand that's going to be needed for schools. And in fact, the aggregate broadband demand will exceed that of Facebook, Twitter, Google, and everybody combined. But the schools are paying some significant multiple above what those companies pay for broadband. And we need to aggregate that demand and bring it together and provide schools with broadband at a much lower cost. So of course, here's the moment where I raised my hand and became less articulate than I wanted to be. So I said, this is a relatively mature industry, right, the delivery of broadband. And this is a case where you've looked at a commercial industry that's providing services to schools and said, schools are being charged significant multiples above what industry is. And so we need to actually sort of intervene and provide a mechanism for schools to pay less. So isn't that an argument against the commercialization of services to schools? We're looking at ed tech companies as being, a primary solution for solving schools' problems. And I wasn't nearly that articulate. But is that a fair question to ask? Am I missing something in that analysis? Or because Betsy Corcoran came up to me afterwards and she said, well, we'll demand that companies actually be transparent in their pricing to schools. And I thought, I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, I think that's one of the interesting things that we've learned, we learned, I think it was earlier this year, that there was some digging into to E-rate, which is, of course, the discounted services, telephony, and now internet services that schools are supposed to be getting. As long as they get federal E-rate dollars, they get a discount. They get a discount on their telecommunications. It comes to find out that many of these companies aren't actually offering schools a discount. Sort of nobody's looking to make sure that schools are really paying a lower rate. It doesn't surprise me in one little bit that cities cut all sorts of special deals to get to get Facebook to build their data centers in the community, or to have Google Fiber top-notch access and whatnot. I think that your observation is actually a very interesting one, and I think one that we need to think about all the time, particularly now that people are sort of so excited again about more technology in the classroom. Is it sort of how are the processes that seem to be in place around buying and selling procurement dollars to schools, and the lack of transparency on the government side, oftentimes. But how does that play out when we've got private companies selling things to schools?
I'm going to count on you to kind of rein me in, because that's kind of becoming it's a way for me to sort of visualize an argument for why it's problematic to think about using the free market as your model for improving schools. And in part, up to this point, I've sort of said, hey, look at the other countries that we think are doing really well in education, and they're not using that model, right? So
I think I think that in some ways it's never really is a free market around education, and I think that we kind of kid ourselves. Oftentimes we kid ourselves to talk about that. I mean, there's all sorts of sort of micro monopolies that sort of rise up around servicing governmental contracts. I mean, because of the RFP process, because of sort of whether it's really shady backroom deals or just the way in which deals are done at that level. I mean, it's actually the free market doesn't come in and sort of the leanest, meanest, most efficient, cost-effective player. I mean, that's just not the way in which things work in government and in other big business contracts too.
I'm going to have to keep thinking about this, because all of a sudden I'm thinking of Joel Klein's sort of hyperbole and the kind of market speak. And if you want to have people making thoughtful decisions about the use of technology in schools, I'm almost sort of going to venture at this point that maybe one of the worst things that you could do is to say that the free market is a good way to settle that.
Yeah.
Because it feels as though that might almost be the opposite of a good way.
Right. But I would like to come back to the education super highway folks. I don't want them to sort of be sort of sucked into this analysis, because I do think that actually one of the great things that we will see out of this is this transparency around data. So if you can actually record what the speed is of the internet at your school, and that's actually public data, there's really no hiding behind the fact that Comcast isn't offering you fast enough data. I think the other piece will be now opening up what Comcast is actually charging the schools, and I think that's just not just Comcast, but that's this other sort of nut that we have to crack with open data around this.
Good. So thank you for doing that. So that critical analysis was not related to education superhighway.
Right.
But it was sort of riffing off of that. But what they're doing obviously is poised to make a real difference.
Yeah, hopefully.
Good. Okay, so in terms of the most clever product name of the week, I actually think SASH was darn clever. I don't like badging, but really, come on, that's a great name.
They got to it first. I mean, that's what happens when you make the first platform built on Mozilla's open badges infrastructure, is you get to nab SASH, which someone was going to nab SASH. I mean, it's the obvious go-to name. So good for EverFi for getting it done first. I mean, actually, I'm joking, good for them for open sourcing it. The code for what they've built is available on GitHub. So hopefully it's this first instantiation that, if we see other people taking, we really do see interest in Mozilla's infrastructure. This is sort of, we'll see more people working with the framework, building out ideas. So here's a first open source stab at badges, no matter what you think of them.
MIT App Inventor has been released.
Yeah,
version 129. This
is the latest version, which is now, this was once Google's Android App Inventor, but back home at MIT. And the latest version, I mean, if you haven't checked out App Inventor since its first particularly since it was a Google product. I definitely recommend having a look at it now. I think that they're really working hard at adding interesting, cool features. I think it's a tool that people shouldn't forget about using, particularly in introducing some pretty, I would say some pretty elementary or rudimentary computer science skills. I like App Inventor.
How fun. Is TechYes associated with GenYes?
It sure is.
Is it part of this?
Yes.
Okay, so this sounds like a really good thing.
Yes. No, this is great. I mean, I think Sylvia Martinez is GenYes, and TechYes is a particularly technology literacy focused part of that. I think that they've sort of updated the platform. They've sort of helped make it easier for students to have portfolios, the messaging, the mentorship part of it. I think this to me, I think, is one of the most authentic and most important sort of project-based learning opportunities that kids have around technology, and so it's a great set of resources for anyone that's looking to do this sort of project with the students at their schools.
Terrific. The e-book lending world for libraries just got more complicated and sounds like worse. Yeah, I mean, it actually wasn't in terribly great shape already. But Hatchet announced this week that as of October 1st, so good thing they're giving libraries lots of fair warning that as of October 1st, prices will go up on approximately 3,500 titles by an average of 220%. So it's increasingly the publishers are putting the squeeze on libraries in terms of having any accessibility or certainly affordable access to digital books to lend to their patrons. I think it's really unfortunate. I think that it would be interesting to see how librarians choose to respond to this, if they push back or what their alternatives are as well. Interesting. New OEC data that seems to be confirming what a lot of us have been hearing for the last year or two. Yeah, I mean the OECD and the PISA scores get to, sort of trotted out all of the time, the sort of ways in which we look at the student test scores and compare them to other countries. But this latest data was sort of a snapshot of things like teacher pay and class size and education spending, and I think it was it's always interesting to see where the United States fits on these different charts and which I would say where all the nations sort of line up in terms of these things. But certainly one of the trends that was clear from this latest data is that we have all sorts of issues in this country around educational mobility, but they're certainly related to what we know as well about sort of economic disparity and lack of economic mobility in this country as well. So poor students perform poorly, wealthy students excelled before anyone else in the world. Okay. I've lost my story here. The next one was for me. Oh, okay. MITx and the Circuits and Electronics class. This was fascinating to me. 80% of the respondents said that they've already taken a comparable course at a traditional school before signing up for this class. Yeah. I'm not surprised by this at all. I mean, to me, this reflects my experience in these engineering-oriented MOOCs. I haven't taken an MITx one. I've taken a Udacity and Coursera class. And in both of those occasions, I felt as though, although they were introductory classes, most of my peers were actually professional programmers. And so to learn that 80% of the respondents, at least, had already taken a similar class before, and this is MIT's introductory computer science class. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't surprised in the least little bit. Again, I mean, I don't think we're so excited about MOOCs. They're so buzzworthy that I feel that so many people are not asking the right questions about who are taking these classes, who are they benefiting,
are kids learning? Are kids? Are the participants learning? I think there's a lot of interesting data here, and we just aren't really looking closely at it.
Well, so we've talked a lot about this, and sort of especially about how MOOCs are sort of politically being positioned within universities in terms of progress and their role in the larger education sphere. We've also looked at MIT OpenCourseWare, and at one point you reported on the degree to which MIT OpenCourseWare is actually being used substantially by MIT students rather than people outside of MIT.
Well, MIT students and students outside MIT, but in those classes, right? So, so people who were participating in some university, who were enrolled in some university class in that subject. Those are overwhelmingly the users.
I think it might be a fair criticism of what you and I do each week that someone could say you're just kind of naysayers. You're not the man in the arena. You just sort of like to sit on the outside and kind of nitpick and find fault with what people do.
I think there's probably Cassandra's, right?
But okay, but I mean, it is hard. It is hard to look at this and not say the way these are being pitched and the expectations for the universities, and then you get this data and you look at MIT OpenCourseWare. Are people going to be pretty seriously disappointed with the money they've spent at these schools when they discover that they're not really producing the kind of outside interest and results that have been pitched?
Do you mean, are the universities themselves going to be disappointed in the money that they've invested in developing MOOCs?
That would be my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that right now this really is marketing dollars. I mean, it doesn't feel like this is very much about it feels like a gesture of goodwill that you can say in which you're sort of making your course content available to the world. And in the case of MIT OpenCourseWare, that was certainly the gesture of the faculty was that, here are all of the materials, the syllabi, the quizzes, the handouts from our classes, we're making them openly available for free online. So you can say that it's that sort of magnanimous gesture. You can say, but I think that it really has to do right now with marketing. It's about making or presenting the appearance that your university is on the cutting edge. I think that schools will be disappointed if they don't have an online strategy. I think that the MOOCs, they don't feel like such an important investment for schools to be making.
I think in order to counter the argument that we're just focusing on the negative, we should be looking for places where we feel like they're doing a really good job sort of thinking long term and kind of producing. I think that was in part what, I know University of Phoenix is a hot potato, but the interview that I did with Angie McMillan, there was kind of an attempt to say, what really good things are we learning about online learning and the ways that can be done, and maybe more stories like that will help for me not to feel so guilty, like I'm just.
Well, I think to MITx's credit here, I'm actually thrilled to see that they've released this data. I mean, this is sort of early data. They've only offered one class, or I guess it's under the auspices of edX now. But one of the things that Harvard and MIT said was that they were really interested in sort of research around this. And I am glad to see that that they're releasing data about these classes and that we can have these conversations. Because I don't think that we should just follow along sort of the hype around them. I mean, one of the news items this week was that the Gates Foundation wants to fund MOOCs for sort of low classes that have sort of high dropout rates, introductory freshman classes that have like low completion rates. And I thought, good grief, man! Like, why does that doesn't make any sense at all?
This is classic, Audrey. The story is $50,000 for institutions that offer MOOCs in high enrollment, low success introductory level courses. Audrey's reply, because clearly the way you tackle low-success introductory courses is to throw students into a scenario where the going rate of completion is about 10%.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't understand. I mean, every experience that I've had, well, that's not true. That's not true at all, because the fact the MOOC that I'm, David Wiley's MOOC that I'm in right now, I feel part of the community. I feel part of the community of, Jim Groom's digital storytelling class. But I think that some of these, the Coursera and the Udacity classes, there is no community there. And I don't understand how you could possibly think it's a good idea to put, in an at-risk student population, at-risk classes, that the MOOC is how you're going to solve things. But, I'm not Bill Gates, so what do I know?
Okay, New York Times had a couple of stories on student loan and student loan debt.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about those? Yeah,
I think that it's not surprising, but this is a boom time for debt collection agencies. There was a pretty interesting look at in the paper at what's happening to students who are finding themselves sort of defaulting on their student loans, and an interesting interactive visualization where you can sort of plot the different schools you've gone to, different graduation dates, and sort of see how your debt burden, if you have student loan debt burden, compares to other universities and other times as well.
And Pell Grant funding fell.
Yes, Pell Grant fell. Pell Grant. This is this other interesting piece of the equation. We talk, we talk a lot about student loan debt. It's good to remember that not every student actually graduates with student loan debt, but most students do take some financial aid in some form, and Pell Grants have historically, have for a long time been one of the primary ways in which people, people pay for their education, and it's a program that it's certainly found itself axed in the past, and it's actually down this year. Fell by $2.2 billion this year, in fact, because they got rid of summer funding for students to get grants to take classes over the summer.
Okay, and we're close to the end here. If anybody could get President Obama to visit a massive online course, it would be the Platt Avenger, John Boyer.
John Boyer is incredible. He teaches a massive offline class. So his world geography class at Virginia Tech has 3,000 students in it. And my first reaction when I first heard of this was that I was like, you have got to be kidding. There's no way that this is a good idea. But John Boyer is just a phenomenal personality. He uses, technology in really interesting ways in his class, and a lot of different tools as well to keep students participating, to keep them engaged. And he's done a great job using Skype to get speakers, use Skype to get speakers of the class, but use viral YouTube videos to convince those speakers to come. And he's working his hardest right now to get President Obama to visit his class so that the two of them can have a chat about foreign policy. So good luck. Good luck.
Well, if you were going to do that, you should do it in an election year. I think he's smart.
I think he's a genius.
Okay, Audrey, we'll close there. Hey, thanks for another great week. Hope you're feeling better.
Thank you, I am. And say hi to everybody in Portland. I hope you have a good time talking tonight and this weekend.
Thanks, Audrey. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.